Hi, this is Stephanie Miller from The Stephanie Miller Show. Please enjoy this exclusive clip from my show on Political Voices Network. Well, let's start. I mean, obviously, the big bombshell. You tweeted about Jack Smith's move. You said this move by Jack Smith implicitly concedes the issue raised by Trump could delay his trial. Smith made a judgment call that he was better off raising this issue himself and trying to expedite the process rather than letting Trump do so in a matter that would delay the trial. I mean, it's a bold move, isn't it? I mean, it could be a brilliant move, but it makes me really nervous, given the makeup of the Supreme Court. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's really I wanted to be real with everyone about it because I think it's an implicit concession by him that Trump really had a path to delay this. So let me just to give everyone listening some background. You know, when I'm representing normal people who have criminal issues, they don't get to delay their trial because they're going to have an appeal. Like your trial set, you can have any sort of issues you'd like to raise later on appeal, but you've got to go through and have your criminal trial first. So, but Donald Trump is not the typical person, and in this case, he's raising issues that have never been raised before. Why? Because we haven't had presidents indicted for committing crimes before.
Thank you.
And so, in particular, Trump has raised some issues that, while, I'd say are long shots, to put it kindly, are first of their kind issues. So he says, for example, if I've been impeached for this conduct and I didn't get, convicted in the impeachment, then I'm off scot-free, double jeopardy. Well, that's silly because impeachment's a political process, not a criminal one. But nonetheless, no one's ever dealt with that issue. It's the first time it's come up.
But
There's
it's
no
always
law on that.
about delay with him. So in that way, this is kind of a brilliant move to go, he's going to do this anyway. Let's go right to the Supreme Court, right? I mean,
right, because Smith knows. So if you go through the ordinary road, if like what was going to happen, if like typically the government would just sort of say, no, you don't need an appeal right now. There would be some argument about that. And then Trump would go to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals and they would hear the case. And then it would go up to the Supreme Court. And Jack Smith calculated, he's like, oh, crap, that could put us past the election alone. So we need to just, go directly, like free parking, those on Monopoly where It's like, do not pass go. That's what he's trying to do here.
But I mean, I think what's troubling is what we already mentioned is the current makeup of the Trump-packed Supreme Court, including Clarence Thomas, whose wife was clearly involved in this, who already voted to try to, keep Trump's documents secret, the only vote. And of course he won't recuse himself, right? I mean, are you as concerned as I am about that?
Well, I certainly think that the makeup of the Supreme Court is part of the equation here. It was always going to be. And so really, I mean, Jack Smith is sort of accelerating things. But at the end of the day, if the United States Supreme Court was going to vote 5-4 or 6-3 to say that there's some absolute immunity that Trump had and that he could lead an insurrection in the Capitol and that's okay, that was going to happen anyway. And so the question is it going to happen today or is it going to happen a year from now? And so Jack Smith's like, well, I'm just going to press the fast forward button and get there. It's monumental. I mean, and I think it's safe to say, Stephanie, it's one of those times when you look at the United States Supreme Court and you're like, this is going to change American history, sort of like when I'm young enough or old enough to remember, Bush versus Gore.
Yeah. Right.
We all knew that, like, ultimately that case was going to decide the election, and ultimately, I think decide. So that case decided so much about our history ever since.
Yeah. Well, and this is what I was going to ask, Renato. Is this a legal or a political point? But don't the American people have a right to know before the election? If there's a candidate that tried to overthrow the United States government, I mean, it's hard to think of a more compelling public interest, isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's the sort of interest that never has come to play before in a criminal case. And so our system's really not built to consider that question, and it never has before. And the interesting thing about it is if you consider it and say, okay, we need to accelerate the process for that reason, if you explicitly say that, you're treating him differently than others, and so that creates its own issue. He has put all of us and our entire system in a very, very challenging position, and we just have to come to grips with that.
Yeah. boy. So I read one story that makes me feel good about this, and then I read another one. The headline: Trump appeal may still take 6 months under the Supreme Court's version of lightning speed. I mean, and I hate to say it, but speaking of politics, some matters have moved quickly, such as their decision to strike down Biden's student loan forgiveness and leave a 6-week abortion ban in effect in Texas. So, when it gets to their right wing priorities, they seem to get to it pretty quick. It'll be interesting to see, right, how long this takes.
Yeah, I've never considered the Supreme Court like lightning swift on anything. There are certain matters like death penalty things that they resolve on a expedited basis, but generally speaking, the Supreme Court's not where you go to get a speedy result. It's not like going to McDonald's or a Chipotle or something. It takes time, process, and so the reality is the situation is our courts, and I think people are understanding our court system. I mean, one of the things that's been, for me, Stephanie, really since 2016, 2017, when I've been engaging with the public on these issues, there's a sense that, maybe we've been watching a lot of Law and Order that like the entire process gets done in like 47 minutes with,
Yeah.
plus commercials. That's just not the reality. Our
Well, I don't know
system
about you,
takes
Renato, but I
years.
would like to live in America where the Supreme Court is more like Chipotle. But that's just me.
Fresh ingredients, yeah, right, for sure.
Yes, instead of moldy, corrupt ones. So the other, obviously, big bombshell is Jack Smith's new filing detailing expert witness evidence he plans to introduce against Trump that includes cell phone data from inside the White House during the Capitol riot, including apparently Trump's phone. So, I mean, boy, that seems pretty slam dunky. Is that a word for evidence?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think Jack Smith I mean, I think he is really fortunate in the sense that there's a lot of evidence as to what Trump was doing during that time. That's one thing about being the president and having all of your moves well documented. I think he's going to be trying to show that Trump never really left the White House. That Trump was in, for example, perhaps he may be able to show that Trump was um, on the phone, talking to whomever. It may be, Rudy Giuliani. We don't know for sure. During the critical time when there was an attack on the Capitol. In other words, he wasn't calling the National Guard. He wasn't,
Yeah.
he wasn't trying to respond to that. I mean, we all saw Stephanie during the January 6th hearings, the footage. I thought it was gripping footage of Nancy Pelosi acting like a true leader,
Thank you.
very concerned, talking to Mike Pence, trying to make phone calls, trying to
Yeah.
get help, because they were in real
Yeah.
danger. I think he's going to create a contrast between that and what Donald Trump was
Well,
doing to show his intent at that
that's what I'm
time.
hopeful about, Renato, is when, all of his lies hit the light of day in a courtroom. Like that, you just can't, he just continues to lie. That Nancy Pelosi didn't call the National Guard, that I called them up and they didn't, and all of this just lie after lie that he and all his subordinates do. And a lot of, like we talk about, their political statements, like this thing that Trump made a demand that Jack Smith turn over evidence as part of the discovery process to help him prove the election was really stolen from him. Of course, this evidence doesn't exist. Yeah, so, yeah, he said it's unlikely to exist. Multiple recounts and audits have repeatedly affirmed that Trump lost. He wants to force prosecutors to go on a fishing expedition for evidence that probably doesn't exist. He says, there must be evidence somewhere in the U.S. government that there was a massive election fraud. Again, this just takes up time, right? And it's a political move. He keeps saying, the January 6th, committee destroyed evidence. Also completely untrue, right?
Well, that's right. And just to be clear, I think what you're pointing to, Stephanie, is the way in which the sort of Republican right wing machine is able to create disinformation. I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only one. We're getting close to the holidays. I'm sure I'm not the only person listening here who goes home for the holidays and talks to people, and you're like talking to family members who live in some sort of alternate universe,
Yeah.
right, where they understand and believe things that have no semblance to reality. And I think that's what Trump is really. He's like when Karl Rove talked about how you and I are in a reality based community and
Yeah.
he's creating his own reality. Trump has taken that to another level, and we have a portion of the United States that's really been deceived,
Yeah.
been deceived.
Yeah. Let's talk gag orders for a minute. A gag order should remain on Trump because of the hundreds of threatening, harassing, anti-Semitic messages a judge and his staff have received, according to the New York Attorney General in a court filing. They're appealing Arthur Engoron's gag order. This is obviously the Letitia James, lawsuit. But I mean, I'm sure you've heard many of these messages. They're horrifying, and directly connected to when Trump makes these threats, right?
For sure. Look, and Stephanie, it's something that I understand personally. I mean, I have been threatened many times in my life. When I was a federal prosecutor, I was in protective custody for a period
Yeah,
of time.
Jody threatened you if you didn't come on this morning. So
Yeah, right.
par for the course here.
Most serious threat I've received. But in all seriousness, I understand how it can be very challenging for a family to deal with those threats. It can be serious
Yeah,
business.
yeah,
What I would say is, the Judge Egron's gag order, that's going to, I mean, that's already been upheld on appeal. That's rock solid, because that's a gag order protecting court staff who are not public figures or just doing their job. And we saw, Judge Chutkin on the gag order in her case, that was one that was a little broad. It was a little overbroad on her part, I think.
yeah.
The Court of Appeals, I think, wisely narrowed that. That's been upheld on appeal. We'll see what happens with that, if that ends up going up to the Supreme Court or what. I don't know. I don't think that issue merits it. But nonetheless, Trump is really thumbing his nose at the judicial system, and he's doing it for the reason, it really hooks into what you had just mentioned a moment ago, Stephanie, is he has figured out that pitting himself as an enemy against the judiciary and against the judicial system not only undermines the judicial system, but it distracts from the facts of what's going on in these cases. And really, we're talking about his gag orders instead of talking about the fact that he committed fraud.
Thank you. And can't let you go without commenting on this horrific, case in Texas and elsewhere. The abortion rulings. I guess my legal question, Renato, would be, doesn't this kind of lie to the exceptions for the life of the mother? I mean, obviously this woman's life is in danger, and she is still unable to get health care. Do you have just thoughts on that, on what's happening in Texas?
Yeah, and I think I agree with that. I mean, this is, by the way, I think this is the horrific nature of the Trump presidency, and also something that, there's a lot of us who were fighting for reproductive rights for years, who were told that this was never going to happen. This is never going to happen, that women are going to be in a position where they could be thrown in prison or threatened and thrown in prison for trying to save their own life. Okay, so but putting that to the side, one point I will make to everyone is, the real dastardly person here is Ken Paxton.
Yes.
In Texas, basically threatening not only the woman here, but the medical providers for providing medical care, even after a judge said that this was authorized. Mm-hmm. And it just goes to show you, we talk about prosecutors, and sometimes, we can cheer on a prosecutor like Jack Smith or whatever. But one thing for everyone should keep in mind, prosecutors having very wide discretion works both ways.
Yeah.
And we definitely have to be concerned about unchecked power of prosecutors.
They do not believe in the rule of law or democracy on the Republican side. That's the sad state of affairs. Renato, thanks as always for caving into Jody's threats. She barely weighs 100 pounds, but she is terrifying.